Hi, everybody. Welcome to LifeSpa podcast. I'm Dr. John Douillard, and today we have a really special guest. He's an investigative journalist, anthropologist. His name is Scott Carney. His most recent book, called The Wedge, which I highly recommend that you guys read. He's written some other amazing books, one called The Enlightenment Trap, The Red Market, and his New York Times bestseller called What Doesn't Kill You. And that was his journey into understanding Wim Hof, the Iceman. And Scott has been an investigative journalist. He wrote for Wired, Men's Journal, Discover, Outside, Mother Jones. He's an award-winning journalist. Some of the stuff he's written about, he personally takes himself through some pretty amazing experiences to actually prove some of the phenomenal potential we have as human beings. And his premise today is going to be that how the environment and training in the environment and exposure can be maybe even more important than just diet and exercise. Understanding that we've been insulated for so long in warm houses and warm cars and eating, the perfect diet, that it's actually weakened us in a way. And Scott's investigated this and proven it with his own body. Scott, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here. I'm a big fan of Wim Hof's. I read your book when it first came out, and it was the first time I heard of Wim Hof, and I was so blown away to hear your story and what you did with him. And you were like in his first class, right, that he ever offered. Is that right?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on. Yeah, that's right. I first met Wim Hof back in 2011 after I'd just written a book called The Enlightenment Trap, where I traced the journeys of people who went on these very intense spiritual, expeditions and went crazy, or in some cases even died. And I had heard about Wim because he was this crazy Dutch guy sitting naked on an iceberg somewhere, saying that anyone could be immune to the cold and he could teach you to do it too. And I thought that dude was nuts and he was going to get people killed, just like I'd seen a lot of people getting killed doing crazy things like this before. So I went out to essentially to debunk him as a charlatan guru, because honestly, the world is full of charlatan gurus. And I had this commission from Playboy to go do this. And the long story short is that, as an investigative journalist, I don't just go there knowing what I'm going to write. I might have an assumption, but I'm going to give someone a fair shot. And so I tried his method, which is essentially an intensive breathing routine and then cold exposure. And I did that for a week with him. And I was able to do the same things that he was in almost no time, because his method works very, very quickly. And, it just totally blew my mind. It changed my life from there on out, where I really saw this incredibly positive and powerful meditation, which is not the sort of meditation where you usually think, some yogi in like a cross-legged position with their hands up meditating. Wim Hof's meditation was immersing yourself in a stressful environment and then going deep inside yourself to control how you react to that environment. So it was a physical meditation, and it had some very profound effects on my health and also the health of what is now probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people around the world. And yeah, I was really fortunate. It was the very first training session he ever did formally, and there were just 3 people in that group.
Unbelievable for you to be there in the early days of his phenomenon. I just think, what's so amazing about Wim Hof was that, first of all, he doesn't care what anybody thinks. The rules of breathing and Ayurveda and being a yogi in India, all the information is so sacred and so held so tightly to the chest that they don't actually want to share it. I studied Ayurvedic medicine in India, and I had a handful of teachers, and you reach a certain point where they're just not going to teach you anything anymore because they're afraid that you would steal it, and the knowledge was just so sacred. But
Right.
Wim just took the knowledge and he just blasts it out there in a way, free of charge, really, in such an innocent, clean way. And I just think it's such a refreshing wake-up call for, getting the knowledge out, which I was involved in when I first got into Ayurveda. I was constantly being told I shouldn't teach so much and give away so much and you should charge for it. And our whole business model at LifeSpa is to basically give the knowledge away for free. We write all of our articles for free. And then, people will figure out we have a store down the road, but the whole point is to give it away. And it was so refreshing to see his approach. And tell us a little about your journey up to Kilimanjaro.
Right. Well, one thing about what you just said, yeah, I mean, some people say that Wim Hof is like this cold guru, that he's like, and they almost say that he invented it. And I think that you raise a very good point. People have been doing this type of stuff for thousands of years, right? I mean, there are, if you go to the Yoga Sutras, there's people who are doing the same thing he's doing. The monks in Tibet who do Tumo, which is the Tibetan version, do something remarkably similar to what Wim Hof does, although they get into it in a sort of a different way. And Wim Hof was not the inventor of any of this, but he is probably the world's best and most prominent distributor of this information. And he makes it very, very accessible. And he's really opened the door to this sort of cold therapy and breath work in a way that really no one else has, at least not in the last 50 years. There were movements doing cold and breathing in the 40s and the 20s and the 10s and in the 1800s where people were using cold water immersion normally, but it sort of died out. By the 70s, it had mostly died out until sort of Wim helped resurrect it. And in terms of Kilimanjaro, yeah. So in my book, What Doesn't Kill Us, I didn't only do Wim. I wanted to understand some of the underlying principles of what cold exposure was all about. How, who are the other people doing cold exposure? And what would happen if I did Wim Hof's method every day for a year, and then also did some things like run around my lake in Denver every day during the winter, bare chested, doing these sorts of things. How would my body change? So I had like sort of some baseline studies done at the beginning of the book, and then I did some studies at the end of the book. But I sort of built up to this really, really big event where I hiked up Mount Kilimanjaro with Wim. Wim wanted to get to the top of it. And of course, I'm going to be shirtless. But he wanted to do it fast. Like he wanted to, usually it takes about 3 days to get to the top of Kilimanjaro, then a few days to get down. Not because it's a difficult hike, one foot in front of the other. There's no ropes or ice axes or anything, but you ascend so quickly that a lot of people get altitude sickness. Like many, many people die. And when I told the US Army environmental unit, as well as the Dutch Mountaineering Association, how fast we were going to do it, which was 30 hours, they basically said we were all going to die in our group. And there were 30 or I think 28 people in our group. But we did it anyway. And what we were doing is we were doing Wim Hof's breath work, which is essentially hyperventilating. We can go over the specifics later, but it's essentially really rapid breathing. And we kept up this rapid breathing protocol from the base of the mountain all the way to the top. And then Wim, me, and one other person summited. Well, we went to a place called Gilman's Point, not in 30 hours, but 28 hours.
So you were doing Wim Hof breathing the whole way?
Basically the whole way. I mean, we did sleep for like 4 hours. And then, so you're sleeping, you're not doing it, but then you wake up and you do the breathing again. But yes, it was very constant, very heavy breathing. Although I will note, it sounds like it's a really, really difficult to do. And while it was difficult, as you go up higher in altitude, and Kili is, I think, about 18,000 feet. Once you're above like 10,000 feet, the air is much thinner. So it's actually not as much work to breathe fast. Like if you're at sea level, or you and I are at 5,000 feet roughly, if you breathe, there's a certain amount of drag in the air. As you go higher, that's much, much easier. So it wasn't quite as bad as you're thinking, but it was still a lot of work.
So you're doing this sitting, taking little breaks and doing the breathing, or doing it while you're actually walking?
While you're walking. And the interesting thing about this is if you do this at like sort of an ordinary human altitude, you're going to get super dizzy, right? And you're going to fall
Yeah.
down and it's going to be bad for you. But as you go higher and higher in altitude, there's less available oxygen. So in fact, the heavy breathing is replacing the lack of oxygen faster in you. So you breathe, less oxygen there, so you breathe harder, so there's more oxygen in your bloodstream. And you could actually test this by using a pulse oximeter, where you and I in a healthy location are like 97 to up to 99%, maybe even 100% oxygen saturation in your blood. And you can just put this little device in your finger to measure in a few seconds. On Kili and people with altitude sickness, you'll see that pulse oximeter going down to like 70, 50, sometimes even into the 40s. And that's really bad. You don't want to be in the 40s. And then, so when you're forgetting to breathing, the world will get a little darker. It'll be like you're wearing sunglasses, even if you're not. You might get a headache, joint pain, things like that. And you put the pulse oximeter on, it says 60 or 50. If you suddenly start the breathing really fast, and this could be a life-saving tip for someone who's listening right now, do that, you'll watch that oxygen saturation go right back up into the 90s. Under 18,000 feet. I don't know about over 18,000.
So when you hyperventilate, you're actually over breathing oxygen, right? So the bond between CO2 and your hemoglobin gets tighter. So why is it that as you're hyperventilating, as you're walking up the mountain, your oxygen saturation was actually going down? It would seem like it would all stay in your blood, not get in your tissues. And I could see tissue hypoxia taking place, but would you actually see lower oximeter readings in your blood?
John, I'm not a doctor. So when we actually talk about chemical bonds in my blood, I'll just be making shit up. You're a doctor. What I will tell you is that I'm going up the mountain, and then when I hyperventilate, I will see my pulse oximeter. I'll see a lot more saturation in my blood as I go up. And if I do this now, if I do Wim Hof hyperventilation, I put on a pulse oximeter, you will see higher saturations instead of lower saturations. If you hold your breath, you'll see lower saturations of oxygen. Why that happens? Right. I'm not a doctor. Things are happening in my blood and my lungs.
Yeah. And that's, in Ayurveda, that's called kumbhak or breath holding, as you know. And when you hold your breath, your CO2 levels rise. And when the CO2 levels rise, that's what releases the oxygen from the hemoglobin and then saturates your tissues, which is why when you hold your breath, you see those numbers come down. But when you hyperventilate, they should go up. But I was just interesting. I guess when they got sick and they were having altitude sickness, that's when they were just a mess and crashing and burning, and their oximeters were getting dangerously low. But there is benefit, the whole keeping the oximeter numbers in the 80s is what's called intermittent hypoxia, as you probably know, and all the benefits of that you get from doing Wim Hof's technique or Ayurvedic breathing with breath holds, where you actually hold your breath and the CO2 levels rise and the oximeter levels come down, and then the body, all the emergency vehicles, stem cells, APO, nitric oxide, all these, repair molecules start kicking in and doing this major repair, which makes me wonder, because here's the thing that I'm curious about. You're just a regular guy. You make it clear that you're not a super athlete. Wim Hof, when you look at what he does, you got to think he's just, a freak of nature. But you were able to do the same thing. That blows my mind. Like, and some of your breath holds, I can't, I've been doing Wim Hof for years and doing breathing for decades. I can't hold my breath anywhere near as long as you can do it. There's got to be something about you that's special. And so I want to know, are you superhuman, or is this something that everybody can actually do?
Well, I think this is very important to note that neither I nor Wim Hof are superhuman in any way at all. And this is a very important cautionary note that you raise. There is a movement out there to say Wim Hof is Superman, that Wim Hof is like some sort of perfect physical specimen. And I will tell you that anyone who spent even 10 minutes with Wim Hof knows this is absolutely not true. He is not like the role model of all human health. He is simply a guy who's able to practice his stuff. He might be a little crazy, which is why he actually decided to do this. But this is totally available to anyone. You can do it. I can do it. Anyone into their 80s can do it, and maybe even older than that. Kids can do it. Like, it seems safe, and it seems like something we can access because, and this is really what I set out to prove in my book, What Doesn't Kill Us, is that, is this a magical thing with prana coming down from heaven that's making us all super strong? Or is there an evolutionary sort of straight scientific explanation? And the truth is that we evolved in these constantly varying environments, right? These environments that on the plains of Africa, 15, 20, 100,000 years ago, when our species was sort of like coming to be, you're looking at these huge swings in just daily temperature, whether it's 90 degrees a day and 50 degrees at night. That's still a 30-degree, 40-degree swing in temperature. And look at you now, look at me now. We live at like 72 degrees all year round in our climate controlled environment. We face no real threats. Like, when was the last time you were chased by a lion or had to go chase down a deer to eat it? Like, maybe once, maybe that's possible. It happened once, but it certainly was not like a monthly thing that you had to go deal with. The thing is that we evolved to deal with environmental stresses, and those environmental stresses were constants. And now that we live in this modern world where all those constants have been sort of like leveled out, so we have these very easy and comfortable lives, our bodies are not primed to reach their environmental potential. And so what Wim Hof does, and what other things that I write about also, because Wim Hof is sort of just like one piece of this larger picture that involves Ayurveda, which involves yoga, which involves meditation, which involves extreme sports, which involves like a lot of human activities, is that when we create stressful stimuli, we thrive at first. This is what hormesis is. At first, you thrive in this stress. If you get too much, you get damaged. But we're not trying to dial it all the way up to damage. We're trying to dial this into the thrive space. And then your body comes to meet that. And then you find that you have these innate human powers that to other people might look pretty superpowery, but are actually just things that you can do.
So there's two things you brought up there. I want to talk about the wedge and what exactly that is. And I feel like that's something that you use to handle the stress. But the other side of the coin, is the sympathetic parasympathetic balance. And, how much, Wim Hof's thing is very sympathetic, very fight or flight, very, and then your body responds. But how much of that sympathetic stress, and is there a way to know how much is good and how much more is bad?
Mm-hmm.
And because the body can get pushed into levels of exhaustion, bar from Peter to pay Paul, get deeply adrenally exhausted, and a whole bunch of other things can happen. And then from the Ayurvedic perspective, they have one of my favorite concepts is the coexistence of opposites. Where the eye of the storm, the bigger the eye, the bigger the calm, the more powerful the wind. So the power, the human potential comes from the calm, from the accessing parasympathetic activation versus just living in the winds of the storm. And it seems like Wim's gotten away with living in the winds of the storm for all these years. And you figured out a way to live in the winds of the storm, but somehow I think you've accessed into the, obviously you talk about in your book, The Wedge, that you've, with Brian McKenzie's work about the benefit of the parasympathetic and not losing that. And that comes into nose breathing and all that kind of stuff. I'd love to hear what you say about that.
Well, the parasympathetic, which is your rest and digest physiological responses, and then your sympathetic, which is your fight or flight responses. These always, they exist in connection to one another, right? I mean, you can't really have one without the other. But I will say that in general, the tone of life in the West is generally parasympathetic, in which we are given the stimulus that we get from the outside world triggers mostly only resting states in our body. Now we can achieve sympathetic states, right? We can go and seek them out. And occasionally, you're resting, and then something that triggers a sympathetic state, like a car accident or a anxiety-inducing email or whatever, can push you over into sympathetic. But we are, as a society, like almost addicted to parasympathetic, almost addicted to fight to that sort of like down human state. Although we also suffer from anxiety a lot. And this is because we don't have that correspond. And anxiety is essentially being in a sympathetic tone. So you have these adrenaline and the cortisol and all those things that go along with sympathetic activation. But but not when you're in the physical state. So you're resting, but you're releasing adrenaline. You're resting, but you're releasing cortisol. And that just means your body's getting these mixed messages. Like when you're fighting a lion, you're dumping adrenaline and you're dumping cortisol and you're stabbing that lion, or you're probably getting eaten. But like, let's say you didn't get eaten. You fought off that lion. You were supposed to be in a fully sympathetic state. Your body was fighting. It was fleeing. It was doing those things. But when we drop those in the rest state, that's bad because you feel bad. You feel like you're fighting a lion when you're lying down. You don't want to do that. And so, as you're saying in Ayurveda, it's really about a balance between the two. And I will note that Wim, he takes a lot of photos on Instagram of himself on icebergs, but he also just hangs out on his couch a lot too. Like, it's about having that contrast between two states. And then when you're in one state or the other, knowing you're there and then living it to the fullest. And that's also really important, is that not sending those mixed messages to your body. If you're going to go to full sympathetic, just go. Just like, run barefoot in the snow or whatever it is that you're going to do, and like fully embrace it so that you can actually have those contrasts between that eye of the storm where everything is really calm and the eye wall, which is where the raging winds go. And when we have those contrasts, it's a lot like breathing. Like if you think about just the breath, the inhale is your sympathetic nervous system, essentially. And the exhale is the parasympathetic system, essentially. So they absolutely exist in tandem, and you're always, toggling between the one or the other. And you need to do that to survive. What I'm teaching in the Wedge is that just like breathing, something like jumping in the ice bath, that's a sympathetic stimulus, right? There's no one who jumps into an ice bath and says, this is what resting is all about, right? You jump into the ice bath and your body screams at you, and most people will hyperventilate instinctually when they jump into an ice bath. And I have an ice bath in my house, and I love taking people over to their first ice bath because it's so remarkable to watch them freak out. And then you sit there and you're like, no, be calm, take a deep breath in and then exhale slowly. And you can watch this person suddenly take control of what is an autonomic stimulus. And autonomic just means automatic, like just happens, like that hyperventilating just happens. And then they realize that hyperventilating operates just like breathing. It's something that you can control with a flip of a switch in your mind. And this is what the secret of the Wedge is. This is like the heart of the Wedge. It's like inserting intention, I guess you could say, in between that stimulus, which triggers a primal physiological response, and then you deciding that you don't need to do that, right? Like in the ice bath, which is, ice baths are intense, but they're not lethal. Like, I don't know anyone who's died in an ice bath. If you have a severe heart problem, then we can talk, but I've never known anyone to die in an ice bath or have a seizure or anything. And so it is safe, but your body doesn't say it's safe. So you're just trying to tell mind over matter that, no, this is safe. And when you do this sort of environmental training, what you realize that it's not to become a better ice bather. It's to generalize that change in your state into any stimulus. Because when you get an email from your tax specialist that your tax bill is $5,000 more than you wanted and your heart starts to palpitate, it's not really a life or death situation, right? You don't have to stab your tax man with a spear. You can deal with that in sort of a different state. And so it's trying to sort of give us the physiological responses for ordinary modern world stresses, and it's putting things back into balance. And that's what, the Wedge talks about ice water, it talks about breath work. We talk about facing fears and how to institute fears. And I have this kettlebell exercise, but there's lots of other ways to do it too. And also into things like, the modern world of psychedelics and the new sort of frontiers about, how psychedelic medicines offer you experiences and how you can modulate your responses to those experiences and how those can have radical effects on how your life works, how you respond to things in the world.
I thought that was really amazing. When I read the Wedge, I really felt like I really understood Wim Hof's work so much better in the ice baths, going into an ice bath and really, and I've heard him say it, and I actually took his mind course too. But I just felt like when you were telling it, I really got that you're talking about that space between fight or flight and parasympathetic, and you can live in that space, and that's sort of that space where you have a choice to go one way or another, and to go into an ice bath and actually just really not let yourself hyperventilate even though you want to, and then staying super calm and really really still, because any little movement is colder, and staying in that real sympathetic calm state, and I think I read in Wim Hof's book that he would just dive in the water when he was in the beginning stage. He was going to a lake and just hold his breath and be under there in the fetal position, right, and just stay in there and just stay and somehow not feel that cold. And I just love how you put it together, where you really begin to let that sensation drive a different type of neurological response. You call it like an emotional neural signal. I think that was brilliant how you put that together, because I think it's something everybody can wrap their head around and actually go, yeah, I can change this experience with my mind right when it's happening if I put my attention to exactly to where I'm experiencing that signal, right?
It's fascinating when you think about, when you start diving into this book, you're really talking about bigger things than just your body, right? You're talking about also these really big philosophical issues of what is sensation? Right. What is consciousness? Because, we are just minds and meat sacks. And what does that really mean? And one of the things that I've come to understand is that if you have a sensation, and it doesn't matter what it is, and really everything you experience is a sensation because it comes in through your peripheral nervous system and goes into your brain, and then there's consciousness somehow happens in there, right? And so everything you see, everything you hear, everything you smell, everything out there is a sensation. And every sensation that you feel is a choice. Right? It's a choice between what your body autonomically does, like your sort of lizard brain, although I think lizards might have choices too, like something that just reacts to the world. And you have that sort of just straight react part of your physiology. But if you can sense it, it means that sensation is offering you a choice to change your behavior, your mindset, or something about yourself, or else we would have never evolved to sense it in the first place. Now, isn't that interesting? Right now, you are being bombarded by cosmic rays, right? They're shooting through, trillions of them are shooting through your body right now, and you can't sense it. And the reason is it doesn't offer you any choice, right? The cosmic ray issue, whatever it is, there's no choice that you can do there. But if I put my hand on my table and it's hard, well, there's a choice there. I didn't have to hit my table, right? I should not hit hard things. And so that's a choice in there in the future, and the fire and cold and everything. Talking to your wife about, what you're going to have for dinner tonight. They all involve a series of choices about how you approach the world. And so the sensory system, what we're doing with it, with those senses that are hard to describe, what does ice water feel like? Well, I can tell you what the anxiety it makes someone feel or something, but cold itself is a sensation, and it's not a word. Right? It is a sensation that comes in. And that sensation, I write a whole book about how to respond to cold water. And I maybe got close to what cold feels like in that book. But your nervous system speaks in sensation, not words. Right? So, it speaks in heat, it speaks in cold, it speaks in pain, it speaks in lust, it speaks in hundreds of these sensations. And it only understands the grammar of those exchanges, not the words that we lump on top of it. So what we do with the Wedge is we're teaching a new neural grammar without words, but with experiences to understand how to rewire the body. And it's a meditation. The yogis have been doing it for ages. It sounds complex, but it's not really. It just sounds complex because words are so hard.
No, I really love it. There's an aspect of the Vedas called Dhanurveda, which is the Dhanurasana, or the Dhanar of the bow, and the martial art of the bow. And when you pull back the bow, the idea from the Vedic perspective is you establish being, silence, become more self-aware. And then from that place of self-awareness, you take action. And that's that point where when you're holding that bowstring and moving it around because you're not still, you're never going to find the arrow. But when you hold it still and then you release it and take action in your life from that place of stillness, which I really believe is what you talk about in the Wedge, is that little place between silence and activity, between consciousness and matter, between quantum field and physiology, and you're beginning and you're teaching people how to get to that place. And from the Vedic perspective, you know, and from the quantum physics perspective, when the field becomes physiology and the physiology forgets that it's part of the field, that's what Ayurveda calls the cause of disease. All disease comes from that lack of memory. And I was so fascinated to read your book, and I was like, you're teaching us how to go to that gap, to that junction point between that place where you have a choice. What door you want to walk through, door number 1 or door number 2, the stressed out, this is freezing cold door, or the door, you know, and the door that allows me to stay calm and stay in the eye of the storm. I'm experiencing the winds of the storm, but I'm in the eye of the storm. You know, and when I wrote my first book, Body, Mind, and Sport, many years ago, back in the 80s, we did research on nasal breathing versus mouth breathing, and we found that when you breathe through your nose during exercise, we published a study in the International Journal of Neuroscience, and we actually found that when you breathe through the nose, the brain went into an alpha state, a brainwave coherent state. The parasympathetic state, instead of going to 0 in a stressful situation of exercise, it actually went up 50%. And the sympathetic, instead of going to 100, went down. So we had the two opposite nervous systems coexisting when we were actually nose breathing versus mouth breathing during exercise. And I was really interested because Wim Hof and that whole sort of exposure side of things is so kind of contrary to how a lot of the yogic meditation Vedic stuff is taught. Like, you meditate your life away, you become so still. You don't engage in any activity at all. You almost reduce activity. But and I'm always like, you guys are crazy. It's established being and then perform action. Take this off the mat. You got to do something with this. Otherwise, you're not going to get the benefit. But Wim did it the other way. He was like full on fight or flight. I know you said he sits on the couch. But then when I read the part about Brian McKenzie and his work, where he was saying he didn't see the performance in his athletes on the field with just the Wim Hof until he added the nose breathing. And I'd love for you to elaborate on that.
Right. So it was interesting. Brian McKenzie is this, he runs a company called Art of Breath. He is an amazing endurance athlete and trainer out of California. And when I first met him, and I met him twice, one was for What Doesn't Kill Us and one was for The Wedge, which is the sequel. In the first book, I was saying, you know, look, we both found this Wim Hof breathing, isn't it great? And he was like, yeah, it's so great. We're going to teach these athletes to hyperventilate and to sprint, do some sort of like intensive cardio exercise. And in that hyperventilation, we're going to realize that they do so much better than they usually do. And lo and behold, they did acutely. So in the moment that they were sprinting, you could sprint a little harder. You could lift a little more weights. You could do like things that required a little bit more power in that moment. He was like, great. So they're hyperventilating, and we're going to see them just like kill when they're on the field. And when he started looking at long-term data, they would get a performance boost in the moment, but it wouldn't compound and actually become long-term gains for them overall. So that was because you're essentially sprinting when you're hyperventilating. You're essentially, you know, the way he says it, you're blowing off the roof of your performance. And when you blow off the roof, it's like, you know, when you're in one of those like race cars, you know, those things you put the nitrous.
Drags,
drag grading. You put the nitrous in it and it goes boom and it flies really fast. But if you do it all the time, your engine dies, right? And what he said is like, okay, well, instead of doing the blowing off the roof all the time, instead, I'm going to train my athletes, and we're talking Olympians here. We're not talking just anybody. These are real, you know, intense dudes and ladies. And he says, now in your workouts, your intense cardio workouts, you're going to breathe through your nose only. And the first thing that happens is your performance drops crazy, right? Because you're so used to breathing out of your mouth that, you know, when you're breathing just through the nose, it's a more restrictive airway, it's more difficult. And then you have to train in that. And then you slowly, painfully train your way back up to your old performance levels, just breathing through your nose. And then on performance day, you switch back to your mouth. And so what you've done is you've raised the floor of your athletic ability. And then in the event, hyperventilating, you blew off the roof. And that's where he starts seeing really, really impressive athletic gains in the people that he's training. And so, yeah, it is an amazing thing to do if you're trying to achieve some really intense athletics. Although I will say, I hate it. I love breathing through my mouth when I ride on a bike, and I'm not trying to train to do to compete with Brian. And it's still okay if you want to breathe through your mouth. Just realize that this option is there. And the more you breathe through the nose, because breathing through the mouth is this sympathetic activation. The more you breathe through the nose, the more you allow yourself to have a boost if you need it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I used to tell my students, be prepared to suffocate when you start first to learn how to breathe through your nose, because that was the whole training technique in body, mind, and sport, was to learn how to breathe through the nose. But it's so neat to see that, because we obviously proved that we actually measured perceived exertion, and during the mouth breathing, they were a 10 out of 10, but during the nose breathing for the same 200 watts of resistance on the bike, they were breathing at a 4 out of 10. Their breath rate went from 48 breaths per minute to 14 breaths per minute breathing through their nose versus breathing through their mouth in our study that we published. So it was like massive differences. But the athletes were trained for 6 weeks, so they had the ability to do it both ways.
I see.
So it wasn't just like the first day out of the track, because you're going to suffocate the first time. So they were actually skilled at it, because it takes a training effect. But it's so neat to see that. It's just so neat to see that because that's what I would tell my athletes. I say, look, I was the director of player development for the New Jersey Nets and worked with basketball players to do this as well, which is really intense because it's a sprinting kind of an event.
Right.
And we put breathe rights on them and got them to do it. And a lot of them thought I was crazy. I mean, probably most of them thought I was crazy, but we did really well. And a lot of the guys stuck with it, and definitely during foul shots where they could compose themselves. And they used it as a tool, like a buffet, when they needed it, they used it. And they got a baseline. But it's so neat to see that's now that Mackenzie and what you're saying is that they actually prove that nose breathing baseline creates a level of respiratory efficiency that allows you to then take that to another level when you open your mouth, when you need to open your mouth. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, it certainly is the game changer, and really just about everyone is talking about this change right now. And it's funny to see how these ideas come back and forth in history, right? Like, just like ice water, which was hugely popular in the 40s, disappeared for years and years, and that was back. Yeah. And it's the same thing for these nasal breathings. If you look at, lots of Native American tribes would actually pinch the infant mouths closed so that they would train people while they're sleeping in order to train nasal breathing. And Americans we're all mouth breathers. We have no discipline when it comes to this.
Yeah, and the male runners in Central America would either put rocks in their mouth or put water in their mouth and then spit it out. I made $100 with one of the Nets athletes. We were riding our bike up this big hill, and he just says, he was like a 7-footer. He said, I'm not riding up this. There's no way I could do it. So I made him bet I could do it with water in my mouth and breathe through my nose the whole way up, and which really wasn't very hard at all, but I did it. And I waited for like 20 minutes for him to get up the hill because I could spit the water out and win my bet. But it is an effect that is a training effect, and it is something that it is back. And I tell you what, for me to read your book and read that about the nose breathing and it was neat to see, because Wim Hof is mostly through the mouth, and it was neat to see that the nose breathing played a part. And I think it dials in more of that parasympathetic, so it's not just fight or flight, which we can overwhelm and do that with.
Totally. Yeah, you don't want to be in fight or flight all the time. And I think that some people who look at, the way you advertise a book or the Wedge or anything is you show the most intense part of things, right? You show me in the ice bath. You show me climbing Kilimanjaro. You show me doing an ayahuasca in Peru. You show these like really intense and essentially all sympathetic things, because that's what gets people's attention, which is what you want to get their attention, to get them to be interested in your book. But the fact is you're always modulating between the intense thing and the not intense thing, because if you do the intense thing, the not intense thing feels so much more satisfying. And I think this is actually a problem with the perception of a lot of these sort of like newer books that are coming out, newer techniques that are out, is that the image presented is all about sympathetic nervous system, right? It all speaks to the sympathetic nervous system. But what we're trying to convey is control in a sympathetic state, is finding that parasympathetic tone in a sympathetic state. And that's very difficult to actually show in an image, because it's something you have to feel. It's something you have to be there to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's that coexistence of opposite thing, which is like, one of the golden rules in Vedic science. You talk also in your book about doing the float tanks and getting into float
Mhm,
tanks, which is completely parasympathetic.
mhm,
So talk to
mhm.
us a little bit about how you found the wedge on the other side of the coin.
Sure.
Not from the freezing cold, but from the completely sitting in a relaxed, sensory deprivation tank.
Sure. So the question is, at this point in the book, is, we have all of these discussions about external stimulus coming in from the outside world and how you manage to control yourself in the midst of external stimulus. But the question in a flotation tank is where you're minimizing external stimulus as much as possible, is to understand what stimulus is coming from inside your body to begin with. And when you perceive something from inside your body. The word in neuroscience is interoception. It means sensing of your breath, sensing of your heartbeat, sensing of your blood pressure, the sense of when you look inwards. And what is really fascinating about a float tank is you realize is that your body is sending tons of messages out all the time. Like there's all these senses, like the gurgling of your stomach, the creaking of your joints, the beating of your heart, the crazy loudness of your breath. And when you quiet the world down to nothing, or as close to nothing as we can get, you realize that that cacophony in your body is happening at all times. And actually, is your body is sensing that at all times. You're just consciousness is not quiet enough to understand it. And when you start realizing and start really paying attention to your internal sensations, you realize how those sensations subtly code your reactions in the real world. And let me break that down into an example. So I went to a neuroscience science institute in Oklahoma, where a guy was using float tanks. Justin Feinstein was using flotation tanks to treat anxiety and PTSD. He found that when you put somebody who was intensely anxious or intensely PTSD in a float tank, that their symptoms relieved with the efficacy of like long-term SSRIs, that's like Prozac and that sort of things, over the course of 30 days after just 1 hour long float. And the reason for this is, imagine your prototypical Marine running, is in Afghanistan, is doing his Marine things. And it's a beautiful Marine day in Afghanistan. He's hearing there's light, sunshine coming on. There's a nice breeze. His body is picking up on all of these signals of the world. And then boom, roadside bomb. His body is dead. He's thrown to the ground. His heart is suddenly beating at 1,000,000 miles a minute. And he hears his heart because, it's so loud, you can't not. And this is that experience. All of those things that he was sensing from that outside world are now coded in his nervous system. And this is the biology of what we were talking about earlier about neural symbols, which we didn't really get into details. But essentially, all of those sensations are coded in your brain more or less forever. Fast forward to 6 months later, he's walking to a grocery store, and there's a certain quality of light that's actually similar to the quality of light that he had in Afghanistan, and it triggers a panic attack because he's right back there, because that earlier sensation was paired with that quality of light, and he feels panic or some level of panic. The same thing is also always going on with his heartbeat. The first time he ever notices his heartbeat is when he's lying on the ground and his buddies are dead and it's a terrible situation. So his heartbeat, which is always going, creates a constant anxiety in his body because he's responding to that subconsciously all the time. Heartbeat means bad. Well, that's going to keep you stuck in your body in a very anxious state all the time. So what happens in the float tank, you've cut out the world entirely and you're only looking inside, and you're in a situation that's the opposite of an ice water bath, which puts you in a anxious state, right? In a heightened state, a sympathetic state. You're in this state that a float tank essentially forces you into meditation, right? There's no outside stimulus. And most of the time, the float tank just like instantly passes by in your experience. It feels like it's only 15 minutes, but it was like 3 hours, because you're forced into meditation almost biologically. Now you're in that state, but you can hear your heart and you're like, oh, now you're pairing the stillness of that meditative float tank with your heartbeat, so that when you get out, you have a new association with your heart, with your breath, with these other things that had been reinforcing your PTSD. And that's why those things are so amazing. It lets you look inside. It lets you feel your body and really spend time with it in a way that most of us can't. because our environment is too loud.
Like meditation on steroids, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's
Where
like autonomic meditation. It forces you into it.
Yeah, it made me, as you were talking, made me think about COVID, how in a way has pushed us all into this sort of isolated state.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, it's created so much anxiety where really just, really if we allowed it to happen and just pulling back the bow and becoming still and not having all the sensory input, which is we don't go to the movies, we don't go to the restaurant, all the stuff we did to distract ourselves and kind of please ourselves in a dopamine reward chemistry temporary way is all gone. And we have to just live by ourselves. And now we have to go, I don't know how to satisfy myself in this way. Where the float tank, I think, just puts you, doesn't leave you in that void. It actually allows you to drop into that place of, real inner stillness and inner calm where you really are at peace. And I just think that tools like that are really necessary for people to realize that there's a world of inner space that was where that eye of the storm lives. That if we hail from there, we're weatherproofed from the cold, the hot, but also the need to get loved, appreciated, approved from, stimulated by this X, Y, or Z. So to feel satisfied, whether it be coffee or movies or shopping or malls or whatever, all that stuff's been gone. And I think people had a little reality check and go, whoa, how do I handle this world now without all of my stuff, all the things that I did to keep me busy,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, COVID has been a wealth of lessons, both good and bad lessons for all of us. But it has been very interesting to see like a societal change of state, which we haven't had in a long time, where the whole society said, okay, we're doing something together. We may not like it, but we're doing something more or less together. And it's been sort of like a global exhale, which is great to our long history of inhale. That's been coming up before this, and I am hoping that we take positive lessons out of this, because we have become more inward focused in this. And I mean, honestly, it's going to feel great when we go back out into the world again with a new perspective, and it's going to create some anxiety in people at first, but it's also we are going to be able to approach the world from a more still perspective, I hope. At least the more aware people will.
Yeah. I think it's going to change how we do things. Obviously, remote, work and all that. It's going to change the world in a permanent, indelible way. But it's really interesting. And I think if people would get this message and use this isolation as an opportunity to really pull back that bow and find something that weatherproof themselves, so they're not dependent on the outside world for their own happiness. It would be that would be the great lesson to take away for sure. You also journeyed into the world of ayahuasca, and I'm curious about the Wedge and how you were able to, in a situation where you were basically unconscious or out of your own control, how were you able to find the Wedge in that experience? I'd love to hear your story about that.
So ayahuasca is when we think about what the concept of the wedge is like you have an external stimulus or a stimulus coming in, and then you are trying to control yourself in that stimulus. And essentially that stimulus is either put you in rest state, which is the float tank, or put you in a heightened state, which is the ice bath or these other things I'm doing. And then you're trying to say, okay, well, how do I use those sensations to choose a different path? Now, in a psychedelic experience, and I flew down to Peru to a town called Iquitos, and I was in the middle of the jungle, like really deep in the Amazon. It wasn't one of these resorts, which in retrospect, a resort would have been fine. But I went to one of these like really deep places, and the first thing you need to realize that it's not just the drug, right? Which is this chemical, this mixture that has shamanic roots. It's also the fact that I've been on an airplane for 11 hours. I went from Denver, the urban city of Denver, in the comforts of my home, to the middle of this jungle, which has totally different stimuli, has no electricity, has none of the things that I usually rely on. So that just moving from one place to another is already psychedelic. It's something that we don't really think about a lot, but already just changing your space is literally you're in a whole new world. So I'm here. They're also speaking Spanish, and my Spanish is bad. But then when you add to this a chemical, which there are there's a whole shamanic literature that I go into about how the indigenous people think about this chemical, but we can also think about it as like sort of a thing that creates DMT. It gives you a hallucination. And what you're doing here is now that storm isn't only the external world, which is different, but you're also dealing with something internal changing, right? And when you think about a psychedelic, one thing that people think about is the person who goes crazy. That person went crazy on that psychedelic and never became the same again. That happens. I will not lie. People go crazy. But you're inviting that craziness into your body, hoping for a lesson. And if you let it, what you do is you sort of, like, the people who have trouble on psychedelics often are fighting those psychedelics. They have these thoughts that come in because the psychedelic creates certain thoughts. And it's almost like talking to like a therapist or like a god, like an external entity is what the experience is like. And then, but it's in you and you're trying to sort of surf that wave internally at the same time you have this external ceremony going around you, which also sort of impacts that. And so what I found with it is that all of the anxiety that I had going into it, which is the, you know, the fear of change, fear of going crazy, fear of like maybe I was gonna radically alter my life and like, you know, leave my wife and become like a mendicant or something, you know, all of that stuff plays out in the trip. All of that baggage I carried, I was now thinking about and facing in this sort of cyclone in my own body, and trying to navigate and coming up with some very sort of profound realizations that then you vomit up in an explosive purge because, you know, honestly, ayahuasca is not fun at all. And it was another way for me to sort of experience the wedge in an internal way, because I'm trying to find these internal stimuluses just like I'm trying to find external stimuluses. I'm being a little vague about the exact details of the trip because it's crazy and it takes me 40 pages to really describe it in the book, because if you think that describing what it's like to feel ice water is difficult, I promise you to describe a trip on ayahuasca is 1,000,000 times more difficult.
Huh. Wow. So, you know, one of the things that that all the research is, I've written a lot of articles about the science behind different pranayama techniques, and the common denominator of all those techniques, there's probably a handful of them, but one of the ones that stood out for me was neuroplasticity, the ability to change the brain. And you mentioned how we hold on to these emotional stressors called the molecules of emotion that we store deep in our tissues, and they're recorded stress responses that we bring out whenever we experience a similar kind of a situation, sort of part of our survival. In Ayurveda, they say it's written into the white matter of the brain, and then the breathing techniques are designed to create a vibration, because it's sort of the waxy myelin sheaths, and it's the breathing techniques and the vibrational techniques were designed to actually change that, so we can become more conscious and not actually do the same dumb stuff again and again and again and again. And the whole point of the Ayurveda and Veda yoga and breathing wasn't just to be flexible and live healthy and live long. It was to live long so you could have a level of awareness to become conscious, to shed a lot of your emotional patterns of behavior and be free from these patterns. And I'm wondering if, from the Wedge perspective, did you ever tie any of that into sort of the psychology of becoming conscious and freeing ourselves from some of these old, from a therapy point of view, from these old patterns of behavior that launch us into anxiety and depression and that kind of a thing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the central part of what this tool, the Wedge, is all about, is that we're trying to break up patterns, right? And you mentioned vibration. Vibration's not something that I looked at. It's something that I could have looked at, right? I talk about 10 different things in the Wedge. And basically what I'm saying is that this is incredibly insufficient, what I'm presenting you with, because there's millions of sensations out there. There's millions of inputs you can have, and every input is an opportunity to express consciousness. And, vibration, since we're using that, right? There's something called shaking medicine. I have a book called Shaking Medicine on my.
Yeah, I read his book too. Yeah, from the Sans people. Yeah.
And so this is, you create a physical practice that creates physical sensations, and then your body responds, because that physical stuff, that physical stimulus does something to your body, and then you also have the ability to bring something to that, and you're meeting these two places, and that is really available everywhere. And every time you do this, you express consciousness, you change the way your body works. Like, that's what consciousness is all about. And it's not something big and mysterious. You know this. Like, you consciously go to the refrigerator and eat a Twinkie. That changed your physiology, right? You picked something up, you consciously said, Twinkie, and you ate it, and that changed your physiology. It's the same thing with sound. Oh, I listened to some Led Zeppelin. That made me feel good. Boom, you change your psychology. Like literally the endorphins or whatever else that's associated with Led Zeppelin in your brain changed your physiology, which expressed itself in I don't know, physical patterns in the body that are real. And I think that we often think that the body and the mind are truly separate, but the mind is built on a scaffold of the brain matter, of the chemical, of our physical self. And if there's something in addition to that, I don't know, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. It's still that physical scaffolding is super important, and it's always in communication. And we're like, mind over matter is not magic. In fact, it's the most ordinary thing that we could possibly imagine.
So for the folks, for our group listening, would you say that, other than breathing techniques, would you say that the shifting from hot and cold is a great way for folks to start and experience this? Like, just going from a hot shower to a cold shower, is that like one of the best and quickest, easiest ways to start to experience the wedge? Or what would you suggest?
I mean, I've been doing the Wim Hof method constantly since 2011, and I think that it's a great door into a way to think about this stuff. So hot, cold shower, but it's not just taking the shower, right? The shower is irrelevant to this. The thing that you're doing is relaxing in the shower, because that's the wedge, right? You're in the shower, you've turned it to cold, and you went from to that's the wedge. And anything that you can do in the world that makes you go and then you go, that's the wedge. That's the wedge. And ice water is a great way to start, right? But it can also be done in breath work. It could also be done talking to your child who's pissing you off. It can also be done, driving down the road. Like all of these things are actually physical sensations. And if you pay attention to how you automatically respond to something, and then you insert a little space there, you're practicing the wedge. And, in a way, like, almost every self-help guru at some point or another says the exact same thing. Yeah, you got to insert space between stimulus and response. And that's what I'm saying. But in addition, if you focus on the sensations, that's your key, right? And ice water is awesome. It's such a predictable sensation. Like, as everyone responds to ice water out of their lizard brain. And it's pretty standard across everyone. I know what you're going to feel when you go there. And so, yes, do it there, but do it everywhere. Like, realize that we're always in these conversations. And if you find that if you're going to a yoga class and that you can come up to a moment of resistance where you're in a lot of trouble, which is stressing you out, and you realize you can will yourself to relax, that's just as powerful as the ice bath.
Right. And real quick, there's well-studied physiological benefit. Obviously, with cold, you're going to build some brown fat, I would imagine. Mm-hmm. But real quick is, when people start doing this cold shower, what are some of the physiological benefits that we know is going to happen to them? Because there's a change, right? There's a measurable change that takes place in your physiology, right?
The first cold shower won't do anything interesting, honestly. The first cold shower, you might have like you'll feel more awake. You'll have an internal struggle in your body to relax in that moment. But you're not going to see a long-term change from one cold shower. It's like the equivalent of a coffee thing. But if you do this regularly, what happens is you start to establish patterns in your body and your mind, and you realize the cold showers get way easier, and you might end up building a tissue called brown adipose tissue, which is what's called brown fat, which is a metabolic tissue that sucks white fat from your body and burns it as kindling to heat your body. That generally only really becomes an important factor if you get really cold and then you sort of need to shiver. right? And it's like uncomfortable and it takes you a while to warm up naturally. That's where you really get the brown fat thing. I know that there's a lot of like Cosmopolitan in Vogue and like Men's Health and stuff. It said cold shower, brown fat. It's not quite that easy because there's a struggle which also needs to occur for brown fat to get activated. And this is because most of us lose brown fat when we're teenagers. You're born with it and then it sort of goes away. So you sort of have to will it back into existence. And it's sort of, it's hard. What I do right now is I'm fortunate enough to own an ice bath, which is like always on and always circulating. It's called a Morozko Forge. It's amazing. And it's always at 34 degrees. And so I jump in there every morning for a minute or two and then warm up slowly throughout the day. But you sort of need the bath to really get into that. But yeah, get cold and warm up slowly, then you'll get this, possibly this BAT. But it's not really important. Like for me, what I think is like what is cool is that you're having, you're forcing your body into vasoconstriction, which means that the peripheral arteries close and shunt blood to the core. And then when you warm up, you vasodilate. So you extend those arteries and they relax. And that sort of contrast movement is really good for your circulatory system. And there is no way to trigger that without temperature movements. Like I can't think, and Wim can't think his hand to vasoconstrict. He has to put it in ice water. And you do too, if you want to experience that. And if you've never experienced putting your hand into very cold water and to see it go red or white, depending on what your physiology is doing, you've never vasoconstricted. And that means that circulatory system is unexercised because it's muscles that do that. And you've never exercised those muscles.
Right. Do we know if the immune benefits if the immune benefits are from the cold or the breathing or both? Has anybody just done the cold and got those immune benefits, or do we know? Or do you know?
It's understudied. There have been 2 studies that I'm aware of. And I know that there's one more study ongoing about it. And we know that someone practicing the Wim Hof method is able to suppress their immune response when somebody injects a toxin into their body, which should provoke an immune response, right? It's called endotoxin. It's basically dead E. coli. It goes into your veins, and usually you get a fever and achy stuff, and like normal flu-like symptoms. But if someone does the Wim Hof method, they don't have that reaction in general. It's like the most elaborate wedge technique in the whole world. What I know personally is I've had a very minor autoimmune illness basically my whole life, which was canker sores, which are these like mouth ulcers that for me, for whatever reason, they're really big. Like they got as big as a dime in my mouth, and I get them about every 2 weeks.
Oh,
yeah, they were terrible. When I started doing the Wim Hof method, they basically vanished. Like I never really got them again. Sometimes I'll get the prodromal stage, which means like the initial, I sort of know one's coming on, right? The very early stage. And then I double down on my breath work and my cold exposure, and they never materialize into like full cankers now. And so I know that for me, it has had an autoimmune change because those are autoimmune in their origin. And I've also met many, many people who anecdotally have, suppressed Crohn's disease, arthritis, lupus, Lyme disease, and all those things. And it's so promising. It's so amazing. And I believe it absolutely fully that this stuff works. But as for intensive gold standard medical studies, there's no one investing in that sort of research right now. Not in any sort of way that a pharma company would be like, forget pills, let's go for ice water, right? Nothing like that's going on at the moment.
Yeah. Well, Scott, I'm going to let you go. I know you're editing a book. You want to share with us what your next project is real quick, or?
Sure. So the next book that I have coming out is called The Vortex. And it's not about Sedona. It's about the 1970 Bola cyclone that killed 500,000 people when it landed. And then started a genocide, a war, refugee movement, and almost brought the United States and the USSR into nuclear conflict. So it's this very different book than what people are familiar with that I write about. But it's going to be amazing because the entire thing is an allegory for what we're facing with climate change. It looks at a dictatorial president who tried to flip an election to his favor, which there might be an allegory there too. I mean, it's a I mean, this book is really exciting, but it's very different than these.
Going back to some of your original work as an investigative journalist again, huh?
Right. Yeah. My first book was on organ trafficking, where I traveled around the world and I found people who bought and sold human body parts. And it's real. It really does happen. It's just not the way you think it happens. And so this is like a really just intense book about a political weather event that most of us have forgotten.
Wow, amazing! What a life, Scott. Everybody, the book called The Wedge. Definitely pick it up. I highly recommend it. Scott, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Keep up the good work. I'll definitely read the Vortex. That sounds incredible. And thanks so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thank you so much, John.
You bet. Do you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe and share.
This recording is brought to you by LifeSpa, where ancient Ayurvedic wisdom meets modern science. Get access to free health video newsletters by Dr. John at lifespa.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.